chapter 15 is on the theory of evolution. Chapter 15, Section 1 introduces evolution as the change of organisms over generations with a strong natural modification process. So essentially we're talking about change over time, how organisms adapt to survive in a changing environment. This is just a little reminder from the beginning of the year about a scientific theory. Remember, theories are not just random ideas. There are things that have actually been tested, generations of predictions that have been tested and data collected on them, and they can be actually tested and falsifiable. So the data has either supported them or refuted them for a long period of time. That doesn't, however, mean that theories can't be revised and changed as time goes on. One of the first people to come up with a theory of evolution was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, and he came up with the idea of the use or disuse theory, which is also called the theory of acquired traits. And what he said is that parts of the body that are used extensively become larger and stronger, and those that are not used will begin to deteriorate until eventually they no longer exist. So, for instance, his idea of how a duck would get its webbed foot, well, they probably start as regular toes, and then the constant paddling of that swimming motion had their membranes between their toes stretched out, and as they acquired that throughout their lifetime, they then would pass those traits on to their offspring. Charles Darwin and Wallace were able to come up with a little bit better of a theory. Alfred Wallace wasn't really well known for it, but he actually came up with the same concept as Darwin. And that concept is evolution through natural selection as opposed to acquired traits. The acquired traits just aren't ones that are able to be passed on throughout generations. They're things that you can only do within your lifetime. So with Darwin and Wallace, they suggested that evolution happens through natural selection, which means that organisms that are best suited to their environment are going to reproduce more successfully than others and therefore pass on those good traits to their offspring. And then those that are not as successful will most likely not survive in that environment and therefore then won't pass on their traits. So that's where that whole idea of survival of the fittest comes from. Charles Darwin collected most of his data while working as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. You can see on the map here, this red line is where all of their travels took them. It was about a 5-year voyage where he collected lots of samples of different types of plants and animals and just tons of data on different patterns and trends that he saw. One of the main places that he's known for doing some studying is the Galapagos Islands, which are off the coast of South America. And some of the observations that he had were about a species of finch that lived there. And there actually were 13 different species of finches that were all similar except for their beaks. So what he figured was that they probably all came from a common ancestor, most likely off of South America, since the islands were so close. And once they got to the island, rather than out competing each other for food, they started changing. Okay, and they decided to change to avoid the competition and specialize their food sources. So their beaks changed so that they could feed on different things. Some would feed on nuts, some would feed on insects, and just all sorts of different food sources to divide up the limited resources that were on the island. And through all of his research, he came up with two main conclusions: the descent with modification, and then that modification happens by natural selection. And this was all published in a book that he wrote called The Origin of the Species. So descent with modification means that newer species are modified descendants of older species. And he also believed that all species descended from one of a few original types of life, which was something different than what Lamarck had originally said. Something also that was different than Lamarck was, instead of acquired traits, he thought this modification process happened through natural selection. So this natural selection is how evolution occurs. We know that all individuals are different, and environment is going to affect all of them differently. So the favorable traits, or the ones that are best for that particular environment, are more likely to be passed down than the unfavorable traits. Adaptation is something in science that refers to an inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of survival in a particular environment. So it is genetically based. A lot of times we'll say, well, I adapted to a situation, meaning that we made adjustments to get through it. That in science is called an acclimation. So when we're referring to adaptations, we're really meaning traits that are genetically based. Fitness is another term that's a little bit different in evolutionary terms than what we would normally think of fitness as. Fitness for evolution refers to the ability to have babies. So the more babies that an organism has, the greater its fitness is. This is a classic example of Lamarck and Darwin's theories and comparing those theories. The giraffe example. So when asked, why giraffes or how giraffes got their long necks, Lamarck would say that, well, they probably started with short necks, and much more similar to like a horse or a zebra, other organisms that we typically see. And that over time they had to stretch up to the trees to reach for leaves for food. So they were going to acquire those traits in their lifetime and then pass those on to their future generations. Now, Darwin, on the other hand, would say that early giraffes probably had all different size length necks, so some shorter, some medium, some longer. And the longer ones were best suited to the environment. They were able to reach the most food, so they were most successful and therefore most likely to survive and then therefore reproduce and pass on their genes. Where the short and maybe medium-necked ones were not as successful, so they were most likely not going to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes. So the future generations became more and more tall.